I've said for a long time that there are two simple pillars that, if pursued consistently enough, and if they are pursued for a long enough period of time, will guarantee a Ukrainian victory over Russia. And I do specifically use that word guarantee, and I don't use it lightly, because I really believe that if these pillars are pursued consistently and thoroughly and for the long term, that a Ukrainian victory over Russia is already assured. Those two pillars are actually very simple. The first is defensive warfare, and the second is economic warfare. But while they are simple, sometimes it helps to go back to the basics and be reminded of the fundamentals. Part of the reason that Ukraine has struggled in their war effort, at least according to the eyes of the media, is that the media has very consistently forgotten what kind of war Ukraine is actually fighting. And because they have forgotten the fundamentals of this actual war, they have often treated the war in Ukraine as if it were a different kind of war, that somehow Ukraine is losing if they lose small amounts of territory over long periods of time. This is a narrative that sees any small Russian push forward as a massive Ukrainian loss, but it's a narrative that pretty much every analyst of the war in Ukraine will tell you is not aligned to reality. And now it seems that the European Union is finally at a political level understanding the actual reality of this war, understanding what actually needs to be done to guarantee a Ukrainian victory, and finally seems to actually be taking those steps, which is very encouraging and very positive on one hand. On the other hand, it does tell us that the war in Ukraine will probably continue for some time. Now, in order to explain all of that, let me first break down those two pillars of a Ukrainian victory that I already mentioned earlier, and then I will explain how the European Union, just in the past week, has finally been taking action to shore up both of those pillars in a way that is tending towards a guaranteed Ukrainian victory. So first, the two pillars. I mentioned the two pillars are defensive warfare and economic warfare. So let's look at defensive warfare first. The war in Ukraine is a very particular type of war, most similar historically probably to World War I. It is a war of attrition. And that means that the war in Ukraine will ultimately be won by the side that can outlast the other. Rather simple, but what it means is that in the short term, currently right now, and probably for the foreseeable future until something significant changes, the war in Ukraine will not be decided by who takes what position today, but rather by the cost exerted in defending or assaulting a particular position. And because this is the case, it is relatively simple to exploit the psychology of Russia's leaders to force a Ukrainian victory. Throughout the war in Ukraine, we have seen that for whatever reason, Russia's leaders have a one-track mind, which is that in order to assault Ukrainian positions, they will send whatever amount of personnel and whatever amount of resources to get small, short-term political wins, and then they will, of course, exaggerate those in their own media back home to make it feel like they are winning the war. Though Russia has taken catastrophic losses throughout the entire war for pretty much every position they have taken, they have not, for whatever reason, not seemed willing to change their strategies all that much, and they continue to send heavy assaults of men to take strategically unimportant decisions. That gives Ukraine a very significant tactical and strategic advantage, where all they have to do is hold on to their positions long enough, and eventually Russia will break itself against their lines. Now, Ukraine has struggled to do that for a couple of reasons in some cases, mainly due to lack of equipment or lack of intelligence. And in fact, we have really only seen Ukraine lose significant portions of their front line in the past several years when there has been a gap in assistance. For example, around Avdiivka, Congress was very slow in providing Ukraine with additional artillery rounds, and that forced Ukraine to run low on ammunition, and they had to back out of that position. And then recently, as Ukraine has had to withdraw mostly from the Kursk region, they still have a presence there, but most of the troops have had to withdraw. That was because of a gap in U.S. intelligence that we stopped providing to them for a very short period of time. And in that short period of time, though they were holding this territory for a very long time, they no longer had the advantage that they had before. But other than these instances and instances like this, if you look at the battle lines in Ukraine, you will notice that Russia has taken basically no territory from Ukraine since its initial invasion. Russia pushed very quickly into Ukraine. They took a lot of territory. After that, Ukraine began to push back and establish their own defensive lines, and since then, Russia has not really been able to accomplish much of anything. This is for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the defender always has an advantage, and that is especially true in today's day and age with modern warfare that is being fought now primarily with drones. Things like tanks are becoming increasingly irrelevant. And so it's actually a combination of high-tech drones and relatively low-tech artillery. And the main way to guarantee a Ukrainian victory is to just guarantee that they continue to have sufficient supplies of both of these items. The reason this is key to a Ukrainian victory, to keep Ukraine on the defensive, is because we have to look at parallels, for example, in World War I. Where, as most people know, World War I was trench warfare that was largely a stalemate, much like the war in Ukraine is today, until it wasn't. Eventually, on the German side, though they were holding up very strong, where they seemed to be holding up very strong, they could not support their front line with their industry back at home, and that created a gap in the front line where they no longer had enough equipment and material and personnel to defend their positions. And after that, basically, Germany very quickly lost the war that up to then barely moved at all. That is something similar that we are looking for in the war in Ukraine, for the Russian line to eventually break because the Russian economy can no longer support it. And that brings us to the second major pillar of the war, which is economic warfare. Now, if you followed this channel regularly, or even if you're new, you can obviously see that I touch on a lot of hot button issues. And because of that, people are also constantly disagreeing with me. Because of that, I find it to be very important that all of my analysis is based on a factual foundation, not just for my own integrity, but also for my own sanity, so that I have a firm foundation when people are constantly disagreeing with me and introducing diverging narratives. And a tool that I use that helps me accomplish that is a sponsor of this channel, Ground News. What Ground News does is they bring together articles from across the political spectrum for any given topic all in one place, but they do a whole lot more than that too. For each given article or source of an article, they identify whether that source has a political bias, how factual they are known to be, and also who funds the source, which can sometimes tell you the reason for a potential bias. Now, just to show you an example of this, one thing that I really like in Ground News is the bias summary at the top of every subject, which basically reads the headlines for you and identifies the competing narratives, if there are any, before you even dive into the articles. This is super helpful because it actually reads a lot more articles than you can and identifies where the narratives are going before you even jump in, which helps you do some initial thinking before you start doing your deep homework. If you want to check out Ground News for yourself, because they are a sponsor of this channel, you can actually get a 40% discount on their Vantage plan by subscribing through my link or through the QR code on screen. And that Vantage plan is the plan that I use to get access to all of their features. Feel free to check it out. Now back to the video. Now when it comes to economic warfare, obviously, as long as Russia still has enough money and enough equipment to keep sending stuff to the front line in Ukraine, Ukraine is going to have to continue to hold and defend its positions. But what a lot of people seem to forget is that Russia's resources are not unlimited. They might be much larger than Ukraine, but again, Ukraine can exert a much heavier cost in Russia than Russia exerts on Ukraine. And so economic warfare basically is the strategy of trying to disable as much of Russia's economy as possible to accelerate the process towards the point where they eventually can no longer support the front line. This has happened through a number of different ways. It's happened through sanctions on Russian trade. It's also happened through Ukrainian strikes on key sectors of the Russian economy, namely oil and gas. And these strikes have been ongoing for a very long time, and the Russian economy is already looking extremely shaky. Now, nobody knows exactly when that economy is going to collapse, but everybody knows, because it is just simple math, that eventually it will reach the point where it can no longer sustain what is going on. Now, while Russia can't sustain their front line forever, and really nobody can sustain a front line forever, the reality is that Ukraine can, or at least they can definitely sustain their front line much longer than Russia. Not just because they have the defensive advantage, but also because if enough partner nations get behind Ukraine, the economic force behind Ukraine will be leagues higher than Russia's economic force. Russia's economy is, of course, only equivalent in size to roughly the economy of Italy. And yes, of course, we know there's this thing called purchase price parity. Russia doesn't have to pay their soldiers as much because things are cheaper in Russia, but their economy is still far, far, far smaller than just Europe's economy, not to mention the United States, if the United States chooses to get behind Ukraine in a major way. Now, even more than this, there is also another additional factor working in Ukraine's favor that Russia does not have the same access to, and that also makes this war a little bit different than World War I, because it gives Ukraine a way to break the stalemate in the future without having to use Ukrainian lives. And what I'm talking about here are drone advances that have been going on since the war began, and that are now accelerating and getting to some exciting points. For example, Ukraine has conducted some of their first assaults using fully mechanized units, fully autonomous drone units that are controlled by handlers far from the front line. Now, these are still initial test phases, but rapid advances are happening, and eventually, when these drones reach the point where they can assault Russian positions without Ukraine having to put lives behind them, that gives Ukraine options to break Russia's front line even before Russia's economy fully breaks down. And again, this is just another piece that requires us to just buy Ukraine more time. Now, of course, nothing I've shared here is new. All of this has been the reality since basically day one of the war, or at least since Ukraine pushed Russia back and established kind of the stalemate conditions. The problem with this scenario is that people have gotten increasingly impatient with the war in Ukraine, especially the United States, despite the fact that the Ukrainians are the ones defending themselves, not American citizens, at least not for the most part. There are exceptions. My cousin himself was killed in Ukraine, defending Ukraine's freedom. But Ukraine is the one taking the losses, not the United States, not Europe. And yet somehow we have felt compelled to get impatient with the war and rush something that can't be rushed. Of course, that impatience can only lead to one of two outcomes. The first is basically conceding to Russia in a war that Ukraine has a guaranteed victory plan in if they wait long enough. And the second is to push Ukraine to do assaults that are much more harmful to Ukraine because of our own impatience. This has been a frustrating phenomenon to observe, but now we are finally seeing Europe finally get it at a political level, And they are finally getting behind Ukraine with packages that will make these victory scenarios that I've laid out all but guaranteed. What I have been seeing increasingly, especially over the past week, is this term steel porcupine coming out of Europe. And the term is simple to understand. If you think of a porcupine, it is a defensive creature that shows you its back with all its spines, and that prevents predators from attacking it. And if predators do attack it, they're going to get hurt. And it's not just a porcupine, but it's a steel porcupine. And what this is an acknowledgement of this defensive reality, that if Ukraine is simply adequately supplied, they will eventually win the war, which is absolutely true. Now, this steel porcupine strategy is multifaceted, but in every area, the key thing to note is that it is a package that finally includes all of the capabilities Ukraine needs to actually win the war. It includes things even like long-range missiles to help Ukraine attack Russian infrastructure and speed up the process of economic warfare, which in the end actually saves a lot of lives, and that's why people do it. It also includes things like guaranteed provisions of high volumes of artillery shells to Ukraine every year, so that Ukraine does not run out of ammunition and have to leave positions because of it. Now, this is on top of Ukraine already having built up its own production capacity when it comes to things like artillery shells that basically meet its needs and have largely closed the artillery gap with Russia already. Now they're going to get guaranteed artillery shells on top of that from Europe. It also includes more drones and more drone production capabilities. Another area where Ukraine is already doing just fine, and so European support is just going to push them over the edge. And likely a lot of this money that's going into drones, because Ukraine already has sufficient numbers and can actually export drones that it's currently using for defense, I have a feeling this will end up being ramping up offensive drone capabilities so that Ukraine can more quickly have autonomous assaults on the Russian front line and create gaps that can then be exploited by the regular Ukrainian military. That's pretty exciting stuff. Now, on top of all of this, there are also economic aspects to this steel porcupine strategy. The first is that Ukraine will have access to, I think, about 150 billion US dollars worth of low interest loans that they can use for defense capabilities. But the second is also a meaningful step that is not technically part of the steel porcupine strategy, but that is finally happening at the same time as the steel porcupine strategy, which is that Europe is finally signaling they're ready to take very significant action against Russia's shadow fleet of tankers. Now, I've talked in a lot of videos about why Europe hasn't done this already, and there are actually some pretty decent reasons behind it. It's not just as simple as let's remove all Russian oil from the market. There's a lot of other considerations. Again, I have other videos on that. But what we're seeing now is Europe willing to take significant steps to finally stop Russia's shadow fleet of tankers, which is delivering oil revenues to Russia, which will significantly accelerate Russia's economic decline. The main thing is that just yesterday, as I'm filming this, Germany has seized and confiscated a vessel from Russia's shadow fleet. Now, this might seem like a small step. Who cares? It's just one ship. But the reality is that this signals a much bigger trend, and probably a whole lot more Russian vessels could soon follow. Because for the last several, I think it's been a couple months, the EU has been working on a legal framework to allow them to actually seize shadow fleet vessels, which is actually quite legally complicated, and there was some anxiety about doing this. But now that Germany has finally decided to actually seize and confiscate a vessel of the shadow fleet, it shows a willingness of the EU to take more significant action against Russia's shadow fleet. And because of, I think approximately 80% of all Russian oil has to pass through either the Black Sea or the Baltic, what we see is that the vast majority of Russian revenue is vulnerable to seizure. And this means that Russia could very quickly lose a lot of their income, and the economic warfare will only accelerate. Now, what I really love about all of this is the timing, because it is a massive denial to Vladimir Putin, who in the past couple of weeks has been pushing ceasefire terms on Ukraine that basically amount to Ukraine giving up and ending their war and conceding to Russia. Russia has been demanding that all aid to Ukraine stop in a ceasefire process that has been led by the United States, from which the European Union has been specifically excluded and not allowed to have a seat at the table. And the European Union is basically saying, well, if we don't have a seat at the table in the peace talks, then we don't need to abide by those peace talks either, especially if Ukraine isn't asking us to do that. And so while Putin is demanding that the European Union stop sending support to Ukraine, they're saying, you know what, instead, we're actually going to accelerate it, which is the strength that we needed to see from Europe. Like, come on, guys, 3 years ago. We're thrilled to have it now, though. Now, of course, Russia will still continue to frame this as warmongering because that's what Russia does. Because unlike the United States and the EU, who have kind of sat on their hands, if we're honest, for the past couple of years, Russia has been fully aware of the battlefield situation and the realities I've described here ever since this war began. And so because of that, Russia has been trying to use every military tactic they can to undermine support for Ukraine. Because Russia understands that they cannot win a war of attrition against Ukraine if Ukraine continues to receive support from Western partners. So because of that, Russia has used information, or rather disinformation, as an explicit military strategy because they want to play on an uneven playing field where they can get support from North Korea or Iran or anyone they want, but Ukraine can't get support in return, so that Russia doesn't have to be defeated by Ukraine that outlasts them in a war of attrition. Now, because of that, the work that I do on this channel is incredibly important, where I bring out facts and logic and counter that Russian disinformation that Russia is working so hard to get out across the entirety of the world, but especially in the countries of the people who are watching this video. So if you appreciate that work and that effort, can I ask you for a quick favor? Would you consider becoming a patron of this channel and supporting future videos like this, where I will continue to do research and bring out important facts? It's completely voluntary. It's just a way for people who want to support this work to do so. But if you want to, you can scan the QR code on screen or follow the link in the description of this video to learn more. Thank you for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next one.